understand how that's going to fit in with building regs. So if we may, I'd like to introduce you to them. I mean, there might be some opportunities for you there anyway, but I think in general, it seems a very sensible question to be asking. Yeah, because obviously a landlord, if they're just going to upgrade one apartment when it becomes available, you don't want to go into the whole regulatory approval process for maybe one apartment. Yeah. But as I've discussed it with Paul, and it certainly does appear that it could need to do that. So anyway, right, Richard.
Okay, I'm just going to, before Paul gets into the nitty-gritty of the meeting, I was just going to do a quick run through of what we've been doing over the last month or two in the other groups, other meetings, because it does have relevance to what we're doing. Let me just share my screen just so you can see where we are. Okay, can you see that?
Yeah.
Right, I'm sure you've all seen these. These are the 4 questions, the 4 crucial questions that came out of our meetings, that as, if not the most important, right up there with them. Now, we had a number of meetings, and we got answers to all of those questions as per this document, which is still a work in progress. You can see we've got a lot of answers to each section and a lot of later comments. Now, moving on from that, the development group meeting, chop that down a bit more into subject areas.
Will you make it a bit bigger, Richard?
Oh, sorry, yeah. I'm saying that. Where am I going? Sorry.
The bottom of the page, Richard.
Yeah, bottom right. It's on the
Oh,
slide.
it's all right. It's because I've got the thing in the way. Sorry.
Yeah.
Oh, is that okay?
No, I do.
Can you read that?
Yeah, that's much better. Thank you.
Sorry. Right, so they chopped it down into these more focused. What have we got? 5 questions there, but then chopped it further. Right, now I've lost my scroll. So where's that one? Oh, there it is. So those 2 questions: what is the current thinking within your organisation about the most effective methods of procurement in construction? What is the current thinking within your organisation for achieving improved levels of quality? So they got some output on for that. It was a very interesting discussion. Now, they were a bit short in that meeting of contractors. So what they wanted us to do is bring this to you, to this group, and see what you thought. Now, we've subsequently been thinking about this again, and the best way of going through literally all those points that have been raised, all those points that have been identified as solutions to the questions, answers to the questions about, okay, but how do we do it? How do we actually do each of those points? So there's a lot to go through. So what we're doing, we've set up 8 meetings over the next month, 1-hour meetings, whereby you can come along to any or all, however many you wish of those meetings, and hopefully contribute and get us answers to the question how. Just will put up a link into the chat, which goes to a little tick box where you can say which meetings you'd be interested in attending. Okay. So after that,
so one of the important things with that, I think, is that it's been identified that one of the challenges that we've got is procurement, and given that the development group is leading that, we're thinking that if we could get the developers to understand why improve, why procurement needs to maybe be changed in some ways to accommodate the new ways of working. And we can also get that from the construction team's perspective. Then we've got the opportunity to maybe make a difference on that. So that's it's that type of joined up thinking that we're obviously trying to do within BIM4Housing, so that we've got both the clients and contractors involved. I mean, if I could just, Andrew, are you from BAM? I know that you've got quite a tight process, haven't you, because of what you do? But is that this is the only engagement to some extent of the specialist subcontractors in the process? That's part of what we think needs to be cracked. But I mean, you've been doing that for years, haven't you?
Yeah, I mean, basically, I think it comes back to I think the suppliers actually is where we fall foul at the moment. A lot of information. So we've developed like most people and what most clients are looking for is a platform solution approach, which is really about standardization. If you standardize the design, standardize the number of components, you can start to then look at the standardized data associated with that. And the details associated with the so-called kit of parts or whatever you want to do, and then you can actually control that a bit more and follow that through. And then we have then the digital data analysis for each stage for each of those components, which it's almost a default position. That's where we are. Where we're falling foul is getting information from the supply chain materials and data from that. They're all into, and it's getting worse, is into survival mode. A lot of the big ones are going under, and therefore they're looking at actually to survive rather than actually produce more information and to support us in the process. So that's where we're at, but we're trying to reduce the number. At the moment, the industry uses it's worse than the food industry. Worse is it uses so many different components, different places, different where you can't actually analyze and collect data and understand what you're doing. And it's not just one component, it's how those components go together that forms the obviously facade or whatever. And that's what we need to start to get to. Therefore, that's where the sort of standard solutions come into mind, where you can actually reduce the number you're looking at and actually understand what you're dealing with. Not only eliminating defects, but actually looking at obviously under the Building Safety Act and where we used to do water tests at mock-ups. We're at the stage where we should be looking at fire testing whole assemblies as well, and actually understanding that. So that's really where we're at as BAM in the industry.
Well, I think it would be really helpful if you could join that, because I think that we've got a number of like-minded people, including Paul's going to go on to what Mace are doing, and also what he thinks needs to be done over and above that. So I think we can pick up on that. Also, the standardization also came out of the conversations that we had with building control around building control on Friday. Ballymore are doing some interesting things in that area. So I think there's a lot of cross filterization or cross whatever the term is. Right.
Filtration.
Yeah. Sorry, Richard. So do you want to jump back on?
Oh yeah, sorry, I beg your pardon. Okay, so now the design group. Now Daz, who leads the design book group, has been doing a lot of work on what he calls his crib sheet, which I'm just going to show you now. If I can share. Starts with definitions. The idea is just simplifying everything. Definitions, timescales. And definitions. And then now that feeds through. Do you want to say anything about that, George?
Yeah, I think the point about that, this is something that David Miller Architects, Daz from David Miller Architects has sort of created internally, but he shared it with the design group, and we're getting feedback from people into this. And the idea is it becomes a means by which some of the questions that people have been asking can be answered with links out to things as well. So this is one way of looking at it. Also, Jarek Wittick from that also actively involved in the design group, he's been doing a similar type of thing with DAS, but he's been putting it into a Miro board. So if you could zoom into this, Richard.
Yeah.
So you'll see, keep going.
Is that enough or more?
Right, yeah, that's good. Yeah, yeah. So in that section there, you can see there's a bit of detail about the definition of what an HRB is, and also over on the right hand side,
Yeah.
the other aspect, what Daz has done, he's added in the information that he's come across from that perspective, and we've got several other people from the session that we had last week also keen to start contributing to that. So if anybody's into the Miro board and wants to use it to both find out information but also add their knowledge as well, because nobody knows everything at all in this area. I think we'd agree with this. And what we're trying to do here is provide a mechanism for people to share their knowledge in that area. So if you're interested in participating in it, we'll put it in the chat. But it would be good to get your input.
Absolutely. Okay, so we're asking for a lot of work, aren't we, from your... Right, let me carry on. Okay, so that's design. Oh yeah, then we had the building control meeting, which George has touched on, getting through the gateways. The thing that came out of that possibly more consistently throughout the discussion was an agreement that some form of standardized templates and solutions need to be created. George, again, do you want to just expand on that a little?
Yeah, again, Ballymore have found that they've actually now applied. They're one of the few organisations that have actually put a complete regulation gateway application through. They've done two, I think, and they're happy to share their experience of that. They did that on the last week. But one of the things that they've been looking to do is to address things by having some standardized solutions, exactly as Andrew was saying earlier. And we think that that type of methodology of having some standardized solutions, but also standardized data that can be then quality assured, and therefore when perhaps somebody like James as a building control specialist comes in, all the information is reasonably well organized, or it is well organized, so it makes it a lot easier for you to make that assessment, James, I imagine. So that's really what we're trying to work on.
James, you got your hand up.
Yeah, can I just come in on a few points? So just going back a step with the higher risk buildings and the definitions, it can get quite complex. I deal a lot with NHS trusts where buildings are linked, etc. There's lots of ambiguity around that, really, and how far that extends. I've been lucky enough to sit on a few working groups with the building safety regulator, and they're very non-committal in aiding you in that. So I might be able to help in that, especially around hospitals and care homes. That's my speciality, really. And just what people really need to be looking at, because you have to be really aware of what building. There's some really quirky buildings in our country, old buildings, how they connect, and just the work that you do can also extend the footprint of what the building safety regulator will be looking at that level as well. So it might be something that I can help with there. And then in relation to Gateway 2, unfortunately, I missed on Friday, but we provide a service where we support architects and the principal designer. And we've got 2 projects that have got through Gateway 2 with us being able to aid them. And that really helps them put the documentation together and make sure that they've got a compliant design. So this area that you're starting to discuss now is quite a speciality for us as well.
Excellent. Yeah, very good. Just to, right, so the last meeting, just to mention, is the advisory meeting we had about 3 weeks ago. Now that looks at competency and accountability with a particular focus on the principal designer role. Something that came out of that was that a number of companies are actually subbing out this role to subcontractors. So we're and again, we are actually setting up a work stream on competency. If anybody's got a particular interest in that, again, please put it in the chat. And that segues perfectly into Paul.
Thanks, mate. Perfect. So yeah, the first thing is, I think, look, we had a good chat the other day, me, George, and Richard, and just around, just some basic things probably for an agenda around construction at the moment, because I think, you listen to all the different things that are going on in design, what you're doing over there at BAM, obviously, Andrew, is really good to hear. And I'm just going to try and probably keep this in relation to my experience at the moment, what I'm going through with external bodies, really. So I kind of suggested originally there's some things probably that are prevalent in construction around probably about product safety regime, how that works with Regulation 7, because I think, me and James were talking here at the beginning, that one of the biggest issues is, I think, understanding how you meet the functional requirements of the building regulations as a builder without considering any other person's influence on how you should do it yourself, if that makes sense. How you basically self-satisfy you can actually get there for your own reasonable skill and knowledge as an organisation, right? Because I think one of the problems is that, since regulatory reform kicked in, everyone's kind of assumed that building control were, signing your building off, that it was, absolutely 100% in line with Regulation 7, Regulation 8, and you met all the functional requirements under Regulation 4 and Schedule 1. But the reality is that isn't their function. So you've still got to now definitely 100% under the new amendments to the building regulations ensure as a builder under 11N you can achieve it. And that also leads into things like change management process and contract. And we spoke about the gateways earlier and the links to safety cases that we need to be aware of, because I'll be doing some work on a project retrospectively, and getting to a safety case, I can assure you, is not a simplistic thing. And I think that is one of the hardest things. I think everyone is going to struggle in occupation to get to that if the work in construction hasn't been set out in a specific format. So I think, the questions we sort of come up with is that as principal contractors, are you sort of planning to take responsibility of being the PC, the principal contractor? That was probably the first question we asked ourselves. And what I'll do is I'll relate this back to things like Regulation 7, because probably is worth noting is that everyone should all really be aware of Regulation 7, because that's not actually changing at the moment. And that may change following on from work that's going on in the product safety regime with the OPSS, but at the moment that is still staying the same, where you need to get to a reasonable level of safety and health in a building, subject to appropriate to the circumstances, adequately prepared and mixed, appropriate for the function for which it was designed, and just install it in a workmanlike manner. And that is basically Regulation 7, just to re-emphasise it. I hope I've got that right off the top of my head. So when you look at a principal contractor, are you taking responsibility for the work? Are you planning to? The question is, I'm not sure you can actually give that away as a PC as a legal duty, because that is unfortunately as part of building regulations, but you may employ someone to fulfil that function. And it's probably just getting everyone else's thoughts on what they've actually thought about on that particular matter.
I'll just emphasize something in the building regulations, Paul, is that this contractual, and I'm finding it with designers, that they're scared stiff of the principal designer role. They're trying, in my opinion, and what I'm seeing day to day, is they're trying to offload it, but ultimately you can't offload your responsibilities when you are a designer and when you are a principal contractor. And also the client, they can contractually offload it in terms of, because they're not competent, and most clients are probably not competent. They come to industry for competence. So there's elements there where that would be acceptable, but principal designers and principal contractors, are clearly nominated people, even within an organisation, and they are responsible for the requirements of the building regulations in which they sit. So I'm starting to hear lots of this. Oh, I'm going to offload this and offload, but ultimately, if they needed to be held accountable by the building safety regulator or local authority under enforcement, they would be clearly that person. And that's documented at application stage for any building control application now, not even at high risk, it's every application.
And that's the big thing, yeah.
So it just need to be clear. If you are designing and it's clear you're a lead designer, then you will almost have to take that responsibility. I can't see how contractually you can offload that really, because a principal designer also needs to have overriding control of a design. So effectively, what will happen there is it will almost fall at the lead architect's door really, and it'd be hard to negotiate how that can be moved elsewhere. Although in legislation it does state that can happen if they're capable, competent, and all those good bits of wording we're seeing. It'd be difficult to see when the nitty gritty comes in how that actually would work. I can't see it in reality.
No, I tend to agree. And Andrew.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure you've noticed it, Paul, but as an architect and leading up a team of 70 people within in BAM, we do take the principal designer role exactly of what it was intended to do in the first place, and Building Safety Act is requiring it even more so. If not, yeah, there's no choice. I've got the whole team in BAM, well, across the whole division meeting today to discuss exactly this point. Up to now, contractors have taken the principal designer role because architects will not take this role. They refuse to. And in the end, to be able to undertake a project, the contractor ends up taking it on board. The belief now, I believe, is that actually the Building Safety Act is actually requiring the architect to take this, or it has to be a competent designer and not just a building design manager or somebody else who hasn't actually had much experience at all. So I think this needs to hit home and needs to, we need to speak to the RIBA and say, actually, your members need to step up. It's just my view, but at the moment, up to now, we've always worked. It's either a design manager working with somebody like yourself, James, whatever, as in support. And that's not really the right way, and that's what wasn't the intent that the CDM regulations were changed and set up. And now, obviously, things are changing even more so. So, it does need to change.
I think, Andrew, look, you're absolutely right. I think every organisation's going through this debate at the moment because PD, is not the same as PD in CDM, and that the additional requirement means you've basically got to have been probably a building inspector your whole life and actually have some sort of knowledge how every single product in the market works, and those people are probably, to be quite frank, a unicorn. So I can see what's kind of sort of going on with that, and I don't think that's something that even most organizations really, especially in the building trade, because you are right, it was under most JCT contracts, they'll just put down, the name of the contractor was going to be the PD, to appoint someone else, you never coordinate with that PD. Now you've got to actually, make sure the whole design is coordinated. I'm not sure that's the builder's skill set. So I do tend to agree with what you're saying there. Let's just go over to Adam Hopkins and I'll go to George.
Morning, everyone.
Morning,
It's interesting on this point. Actually, we've been talking to our supply chain both on the kind of consultancy side and also contractors and developers actually, and it's been interesting. I think it's perhaps as people have reread the regulations, had meetings like this, their stance or position has changed almost on a sixpence overnight, which has been quite interesting. Architects that we've spoken to were kind of quite cool about, before the builder turns up, doing the principal designer role, and cool. I mean, who else would in that position? And then there was, I think, as others were suggesting, there was a kind of, well, not me when there's a builder, because they're going to be pulling the strings, which was, so that was interesting from the consultant side. But what's more interesting, and has been a more recent development, has been we've met, as I say, lots of contractors, developers, and the latest thinking from them is they're saying, yeah, I'll be principal contractor, I'll be principal designer, that's all fine, that makes sense, you know, particularly in a D&B situation in that scenario, because I'm, you know, responsible for the design and the completion of the works. But what we're finding is that the contractors, developers potentially are struggling or are going to have a hard time demonstrating their competence in that role. None of them are suggesting delegating the function. So we're having there's an ongoing discussion at the minute, and I'm obviously not going to name names, but we're looking at ex-builder who's saying, I'll be your PD. And we're saying, well, okay, show us your management policies, procedures, systems, all of that good stuff, and you know, explain to us through those things how you plan, manage, monitor, coordinate work. And the response was to send us a load of third-party accreditations going, well, I've got construction line and I'm ROSPA this and I'm a member of CIOB. And it was kind of like, that's cool and all, but most of those things actually speak to a principal contractor competency, not a principal designer competency. And you need to demonstrate more than just giving us a load of bits of paperwork, like you've paid your subs to a certain person, or you know, you've got a certain accreditation. One of the ones was NHBC. We're an NHBC registered builder. Best as I can tell, that means NHBC once turned up to a job, agreed that you were building it in line with their warranty requirements, and then gave you a thumbs up, and you give them 1,200 quid a year or something. So yeah, we're, as it stands and as I sit here at the minute, I'm struggling to imagine many or any contractors being able to take on that role. Andrew, I was Googling you in the background. We've not met before, but I see kind of BAM Designs are part of BAM. I worked with BAM a long time ago in the Midlands as a contractor. So it might be very different for you, but I think generally it appears that contractors will struggle to demonstrate competence for the PD role, as I see it.
Yeah, I just had it before. I know George and James have got their hands up. Sorry, just to answer that one, really. Yeah, no, I think so, and I think fact, well, as I say, that the contractors have just gone ahead with it, and I would say, shall I say, got away with it for now. And I think this is a comeuppance, so we need to do something about this. I think the danger is just to pick up as an architect, and coming through, I went to university, but I took 2 years out working on site, working on whatever, and I got a lot of technical. Most designers and engineers, and including supply chain, including contractors, don't have any technical experience whatsoever. They're relying on somebody else, and that somebody else doesn't exist anymore.
No, that's right.
And that's where we're at. The whole business has gone down. Hasten just to add just a quick, an architect at say Kingston University. I went there as my diploma, having done a degree elsewhere. All they had to do was photograph a building site from outside it, and that got the technical tick in the box. That's a 7-year course, and yet that's all they had to do. And it's no wonder that architects can't do this. So that's why I say, if we're realistic and say that actually the architect should be taking this on board and leading it, no excuse, PI insurance aside, then we need to be speaking to the universities, need to speak to the RIBA, and actually, if that's the way forward, then that's the way something needs to happen. And the worst case is, you know, I could see architects delegating all their responsibilities. They're all CDP packages now. They're not taking anything on waterproofing, fire, or anything. In the case, what they want to do, again, having worked at one of the top 3 architectural practices in the world and landmark buildings, is they want to have pretty pictures that get an award. And it's about building buildings properly, and that's the key. It's not paper. So anyway, I'll stop there. Sorry, George and James. I'll get off my chest. Yeah.
I was just going to say that as far as architects taking on that PD role, I started asking questions of the people I know over the last year, and it was very interesting. I was talking with, we work closely with PRP, and I know Scott Sanderson very well, and Scott said that probably 18 months ago, they decided that they were going to take on the PD role because that's just the way PRP work, and they were going through the process of trying to understand exactly what that meant so that they could put procedures in place. But he was saying that they are a member of a group of architects that are in London, I think, large architects, and they were the PRP were the only ones out of the 10 or so that were in that group that were going to go forward with the PD role. He said subsequently, all of them, I think bar one, has agreed to said that they're going to do it. So I thought that was quite telling, really. The other thing that Scott shared with me was that the way they're looking to do it, one of the biggest challenges, obviously they can oversee the architectural side, but things like building services and structure and things, they need to be reliant on other consultants to do that, and they're working out the best way of doing that from a checklist and a process perspective that can then be managed. So anyway, I hope that's helpful.
I was just to go on to the back of that, George. I'm, not going to name names because not in the business of doing that, but we did speak to PRP, and we do obviously work with PRP quite frequently, and I think that's no secret. And PRP were one of the more proactive practices consultancies that we spoke to, and it was clear that they've been working on this for a long time. I also am aware of that group, George, but the name escapes me. They've got a name for the collective, and I think I know the other practices that are on it, but they've been working for a while. And the way that the kind of approach was described to me was this kind of let's call it a platform approach, but the terminology they were using was structured questions to each part of Schedule 1, which is good. And I think nobody we spoke to wanted to get into the business of checklists, but certainly having kind of a memoir and questions at particular stages of design development, perhaps anchored to a rebus stage, was seen as a good way of in part discharging the duties of the principal designer. I think the role is plan, manage, monitor. It's being able to challenge. I think that's the words that HSE use, isn't it? It's being able to challenge other designers. You can't know everything. No one ever will, but you know enough to ask a mechanical engineer at a certain point in time whether they considered certain parts of the smoke ventilation system, or to ask somebody about a fire alarm system at a certain point along the way. So that approach seems to make sense to me, and appears to be a sensible way to discharge the duties of a principal designer. I think it becomes increasingly more complex when you are at the construction stage or approaching the construction stage. It really depends on procurement, but when you've got more specialist design and you've got a far wider range of specialisms coming together to work on discrete parts of the design, I think then it becomes quite challenging, which is again a kind of argument against the builder doing that principal designer role, I think, unless they can very clearly set out how they kind of plan, manage, monitor, coordinate. And we're not seeing evidence of that so far from the people we're talking to.
No, that's a really good point you've said there, Adam, because I think I'm going to pass this on to James in 2 seconds. I think that the big thing is if you give it to if the builder takes it on board, is it yourself certifying with your own people that you're getting to what's correct? Or actually, the point in this, and you mentioned smoke control, when you look at it from an architect's point of view, they are not conversant on all the different codes for the products that make a system operational for smoke control, whether it's an automatic system, a manual intervenable system, whether it's a multi or single compartment, it's doing general ventilation and smoke. That is where the building services engineer, or another that is specialist, needs to be involved. Where the PD would sit in that is by saying, this is the operational strategy of the building I've got from the client. Does your system meet that obligation, and does it comply with all the other functional requirements for the ventilation, any part O requirement, any part L requirement, and ultimately part B for smoke control? That's the bit I think where you allude to, which I totally agree with, that they can be the ones that bring the information in, but the other specialists are the ones that will be responsible for supplying it, if that makes sense. And James, hopefully you agree with that, Adam. And James, I'll go over to you next. If not, Adam, to, say now if I've explained that wrong. So.
Yeah, there's quite a few key takeaways and advice that I give in around the principal designer role as a duty holder role. But if you actually look in legislation, it's actually all designers fall under that as well. So anyone within the design team. So the government and building safety regulator are very aware that there will be specialists in there. And what I'm sort of communicating to the principal designer, the duty holder role themselves, is you have to sign a compliance declaration statement at the end of a project now and provide that to building control. I'm sure some of you will be aware of that. And what we're actually saying is, if you are the lead principal designer in the duty holder role, there would be due diligent of you to get compliance declaration statements from the other designers. So if it's a fire engineer and they're doing their competency, they're doing their design and they're competent and you've looked at that, then you would really basically ask them to provide a statement, which is you showing that you're asking that competency from them as well. And then if you're ever challenged by the building safety regulator or the local authority under enforcement, you'll be able to provide that information. So that's a key takeaway that seems to be reasonable, I would say. And I don't know if you're aware around competency and of the duty holder roles, especially the principal designer role at the moment, but the RIBA and CIAT actually have a course they've put together. What we're expecting to happen is when the Grenfell inquiry final report is released, which has now been pushed back to the end of the summer, we are expecting something within that to show that everyone should show competence in the way that building inspectors currently are having to. And that alludes to what we're seeing in industry at the moment, where these competency routes are being put together. Some of them are in the very early stages. RIBA are very much at the forefront of that. But that does tick the requirement of what Dame Judy Fackett required of raising competence, but also competence being reviewed over a period of time, which seems to be around the 4 or 5 year mark. And what we're expecting is all the duty holder roles eventually will be on a listing, a public listing. And when you declare yourself as a duty holder under the building regulations, the building inspector will look on that list, and that is you showing your competence to the building inspector and the building regulation process. And I can see that being either issued with heavy guidance from the building safety regulator and government, or some additional legislation that may come off the back of the Grenfell inquiry report and it being put into legislation eventually. So I think there is a lot of work in that area being done.
Yeah, well, I agree. I was going to say James King.
That's what I was going to say. Yeah.
All right, let's turn it on. Hi, I don't think I've met any of you before. I'm from Devonshire on the PSL and the construction team. I just wanted to add a little something to what James was saying in terms of delegating down competence. My reading of it is that I think it goes a bit more than it just being a good idea to get that sort of competence declarations from people that are where it's being subbed down from fire engineers and things like that, because in order for the client to be able to properly give their competence declaration at the gateways, they're going to have to declare that they've taken all reasonable steps to satisfy themselves that the person who is appointed as the PD can meet the specific competence requirements for that role. And if they are delegating it down, it includes the organizational capability to undertake that role. And that definition of organizational capability means anyone they're control of, so including some subcontractors, have the necessary skills, knowledge and experience and are appropriately supervised. So they're going to need to have that information at the point of Gateway 2 to make that declaration for it to be accepted. I think so.
Can I just jump in, James?
Yeah, sure. Go ahead.
You mentioned Gateway 2. It's just the terminology. Gateway 2 is just predominant higher risk buildings, but duty holder roles are.
Oh yeah, it applies to all.
Yeah, so I just want to get the terminology spot on because there's a lot of misinformation.
Yeah, there is. Yeah.
So these roles are applicable to all projects.
Yeah,
anything
they
from
are. Sorry, I should have clarified that. I was focusing on the higher risk ones for that thought, but yeah, I agree. It does apply to everything.
And Joe, this is really good. 'Cause it's all leading into the next bit around PC as well, George. I mean, look, I think the takeaway bits here are quite prevalent. Is that when you look at a principal designer, and obviously their additional duties on top of being a designer, one of the hard things I think we all kind of allude to here is that some of these systems they're expected to say have been, and I put a copy of that from the the building regulations amendments in this. So it's just there for everyone if they needed it. To get to the point where they say we believe that the design of this building is essentially compliant, revolves around complications of product type selections, performance, whether it's reaction to fire, resistance to fire, how the product performs. I mean, a good example is you can have a powered access door which allows people that are less able to go through it, but then you might have a powered access door that also has to perform in fire. Both functions must be met. And that functional requirement will come from different designers or even different supply chain, depending on how that design is being procured. And that's the hard bit, I think, for a PD to actually get to the point of saying, I'm happy with it. And I agree that this has been mentioned before. And I think, Adam, maybe you said it, is that it might have been you, James, I can't remember here, but essentially you'll be looking for declarations probably from all those key designers to say we are confident what we've given you is correct and it meets the functional requirements, and the PD can then say, I'm happy that it all works together. I think the next part of that then is actually how does the PC role work within all of that, if that makes sense. Unless I've said anything anyone doesn't agree with, then just say now.
I would say that should mimic what's happening in the for the principal designer. You'd expect the principal contractor to go out through the subcontractors. They will be the principal contractor under the duty holder role.
Yeah.
And then effectively any they have some overriding control on what's going on and the subcontractors there, and it should really mimic the same thing in my opinion. And it's about protecting themselves as well, because ultimately what will happen with the duty holder roles is they will be the first port of contact if there is enforcement action to be taken on a project. That they will sit around the table with the local authority building safety regulator and probably the building inspector for that project, being a licensed profession now. And we won't get the big Grenfell inquiry that we had where thousands of hours and so many people involved. It will be clear cut who you go to and who is responsible. And the reality of this is that the building safety regulator will actively be looking for this, so they can start to show industry that actually through enforcement this is what we'll be looking for. And these things are things that you need in place if you are a duty holder to protect yourself, really, because that does then form what the requirements are of the building regulations. It's like quality management systems, etc., and how that all expands. That's my
I tend to agree personally, but I think we'll go over to Andrew Pike.
Yeah, thanks for that.
Pike.
Yeah, no problem.
See, no wrong there.
Just linking up there with that point, I think the PD role and PC role have to work very closely together, and I'm not sure it needs to improve a lot more than it is, because at the moment, I think at PC, I don't think anyone can guarantee has that building been built in relation to the design and specification that was intended to. I think just looking in BAM, a number where defects have occurred is where the supply chain have gone off-piste and done their own thing and done something different. And therefore, no one's got no record of that. So we're being pushed to get as-built information, as-built models, as-built data, but almost nobody knows exactly what was built, or something was changed, or something was missed out. So I think the industry needs to find a way of actually get to the point of knowing exactly what was built, and therefore you can have a compliance certificate. Otherwise, it's just last recorded almost. Whatever anybody's recorded, that's what you've got. And then something occurs later, and then you find out it wasn't built according to that. So it unravels, which is where you don't want to be at. So it's just a problem how we get to that point.
And over to Adam.
Thanks, Paul. James made a really good point a moment ago about obviously applying to all the different all building work, but on the PC demonstration of competencies and one of the duties, I think what's interesting and what I've observed now and in my experience is that principal contractors, and I think this is a consequence of industry being fragmented, they're kind of very good at going manage that subcontractor, and actually to fulfill the duties of the principal contractor, there needs to be much more focus on how all of those different trades and all those different suppliers overlap and come and work together. And we're not seeing, from the people we've spoken to, we're not seeing much articulation around how packages and package interfaces are being managed, how program feeds into that, how, you know, there's a kind of push-pull with the supply chain in terms of restart meetings, all that kind of good stuff. I've worked for some good companies in the past that have some of that written down, but I think even that's probably quite light touch. I think there's kind of this tendency to just kind of, you know, have a few kind of forms and ways of doing things, and then actually a lot of it comes down to the experience of the manager in question. I think actually now, obviously, the focus needs to be more on getting that down on paper and really running with it and being able to evidence that you've done that all the way through, just the same as I think it was James or it was perhaps Paul that was making the point about the principal designer being able to do the evidence. It's, you know, the way the regs are written, you just change the word designer for contractor and building or design for building, and then you're left with the same duties. So totally we're kind of, you know, at the minute we're going, oh, principal designer, how's anyone going to do that? But actually principal contractor, you know, is just as challenging. And I really don't know, I mean, where you would start in evidencing all of that to a client at the moment. So yeah, we're gonna have an interesting year or two, I think.
And back over to James quickly. Totally agree, Adam. I think how principal contractors are going to do it, because I like you, I actually believe they've got the biggest responsibility out of all of this, because ultimately contractually they will be holding liability to ensure they have got the reasonable skill and care to manage the work anyway. So let's just go back to James quickly, because I don't want to go on myself.
Just a few points there, Paul. You're right. Actually, when we get to the nitty gritty of the Building Act, so Regulation 35 actually covers enforcement for those that are undertaking the works, and that falls right at the door of the principal contractor, really. So, you know, they can have, and that the enforcement side of it, although it's extreme, I think it's important to understand what could happen in the worst case scenario is that there is now changes within that section of the Act where they can be imprisoned for up to 2 years with an unlimited fine, where beforehand it never went to Crown Court. So there is elements of that in the worst case scenario. But just getting on to as-built drawings is really interesting. It sort of touches on Andrew's point. There is actually a requirement in legislation now that collaboration between the duty holders takes place, very much on a risk-based process. So we expect the larger the project, the more involvement the duty holders have on site as well. And that's any changes basically being communicated on any project. Now, at higher risk building level, there's the change control application with the building safety regulator, where you have to put an application in when you make a change. For me, in some projects, it almost makes design and build unviable. If you're value engineering a project to such extremities, you can't undertake that change until the building safety regulator have approved that. And ultimately, I think that maybe at that level makes a project unviable if the idea is to continue value engineer it. And then Regulation 38 for fire safety information. It's always been there, but one of these things that we've just brushed over, but it's very much now in the forefront. There is a requirement that the responsible people of the building eventually have as-built drawings so that they are aware of how they can manage and risk assess the buildings. So there's an element that the principal contractor, any changes that are happening, need to go back to the design team to be able to provide that information at the end, if it works in the procurement process like that. But ultimately, under the golden thread of information, which they're saying is only applicable to high risk buildings, but it should be good working practice that we do it to all buildings now. And I'm clear that that will likely come in as well. And effectively, the person who is managing the building needs to know what they are managing in occupation for any building. So there is a real requirement now that any changes that are made on site are represented. And what it goes back to this again, if you're ever challenged and that doesn't happen, how are you going to protect yourself? You know, it's very much, there's very much stuff in legislation now around behaviours and collaboration. and ultimately, if you are questioned, how do you protect yourselves, or how do you give that information to those that are asking awkward questions?
Yeah, no, I've been Jane. I mean, it's absolutely spot on. I think, because I need to go over to the other two, to Cliff and Chris here in a second on this. I think the hard bit is that if you look at the value engineering argument, you can value engineer from a defined product, right? And this is the way I've tried to explain it: is that if you know the building purpose group, the risk of the space, how that product operates, how it was classified, what other functional requirements in the operation it was meeting, how it fits within the walls or the floor substrates of the building, and how you installed it, and changing that product does not affect any of that, it's not an issue. But the minute you change anything in resistance or classification down, etc., you're in a major change. So
You tell me in reality how that never is a major change.
Yeah.
You change installation supplies and external wall build-up. The building inspector, is going to want to know what are the characteristics of those products. One is clearly in value engineering, it's going to be a less spec product than the higher. And we're getting back onto what happened at Grenfell, aren't we? The nitty-gritty of it is. The building inspector didn't have a chance on that project if you look at the detail, because he never really knew the information that's provided.
Yeah. The point I made, I think you've said it there really, really well. And it's not me trying to lead anyone to any, because we've all got our own knowledge here, is that if you're going to change something, you have to have defined originally all those key parameters so you can judge apples with pears or apples with apples. And at the moment, when you look at from an architectural design perspective, no disrespect to them, the classification code for one pipe on a wall was about this big.
Yeah.
And we're not even defining that at the moment. So if you go through a definition process to get in there, then you can monitor against what you're changing. Then you can say, is this a minor? Is it a major? Or is it nothing at all? Or I'm at the process where I've not even got to the point of submitting it. That's the bit that at the moment doesn't kind of exist. So it just goes back to the point that when you look at the builders and you go from PD to PC, I think the owners tend to sit with the builders who have gone through that assessment to say, we know what it is, how it performed, we worked through with the design team, that's the code for it, that's what it does. And at the moment, that's the bit that, on information that's not going through, if that makes sense.
Insulation's a classic example, okay?
Yeah.
I see this day to day. I look at all spectrums of product of projects, from large high-risk buildings all the way down to your loft conversions, etc. And you'll see on a specification from an architect, Kingspan insulation, 150 mil, for example. Well, most will say, well, I'm not buying Kingspan. I'm going to go and buy another product, okay, which is a value engineer of their value engineering that of their choice. But the product itself is, in most instances, going to be a less performing product. And it's that whole, especially at the higher risk building element of it from the building safety regulator, it's design that building well and then produce that building on site to the specification. And if you are going to make a change, then effectively we need to know about it before you do it, and we can approve it. And and at that level, you'll get into that nitty gritty as well. And that's what people need to be aware of.
Totally agree. I'll go over to Cliff next. Cliff Neal. You there, Cliff?
Sent him to sleep.
He's probably bored him to death. Bless us. I'll do Chris just Chris Marlin first.
Hi there. It's just interesting listening to your conversations about the principal designer and principal contractor. So at the moment, I'm working for the Houses of Parliament Delivery Authority. So whereas all the conversations I've been listening to today is direct conversation between the client and those principal contractors, but essentially, we're at the moment sitting in the middle as a delivery authority. So I know we'll talk to the contractors directly, and we expect to get the deliverables in so we can actually do our sense checking to see if things are going to fit in. So essentially, we'll have some sort of information drop, and then it will go into the different design and technical assurance teams to sense check it itself. So I know it is a large program, which is probably why we need the middleman. It's going to be rife with other things because we've got an extra layer, but it might be you might need a principal manager who would actually take on that function to make sure those designs for each discipline are actually going to work out. So it might not help you all, but I just thought I'd let you know.
Yeah, that's grand. That's great. Chris Neil, are you there still? Thanks for that, Chris. Brilliant. So Cliff Neil.
I think he's got a problem with his microphone. I saw him switch it off. Yeah.
That's right. What I'd say is I'm being called in, George, for another meeting in about 10 minutes here. Unfortunately, I'm getting some bother from the others. What I was going to say, there was a few other questions I think we put down, George, and I think we've answered some of these as well. I'm just going to read these out. It was considering this is not just HRBs, how do we believe this will work? And I think that's been answered very well from James as well, because the bottom line is, even though it's just not HRBs, I think the point is it isn't just HRBs. You need to protect yourself on every piece of work that you do. So if anyone comes back and says, how did you arrive at all of those pipes in the wall? You can say, that's the mechanical design, that's the pipes that we use, that's the functional requirements on the H1, H3, G1, G3, or whatever it's going to be. It can be part J. That's the reaction to fire that material. This is why it was chosen. And the seal that's come from Hilti Rockwell, one of the upgraded manufacturers out there, with the type of oil that's been used, is compatible with all of it. And if you haven't got that information, you're going to be in trouble, I think, on any projects in the future. And I think hopefully everyone would agree with me on that. That's the reality of where we're going to, The other question I had on here, and I won't do all of these, Jules, because I'll let you carry on with some of these. I'll maybe put them in the chat. Was, how do you believe this work between the principal designer and at the design stage, interface at the construction stage with yourselves as principal contractors? And I think we've kind of answered that. Just change the PD to the PC. Just understand that basically you actually basically, as a builder, in my view, you need to verify the adequacy of everything that's been selected and satisfy yourself you can actually construct it in the space. This all comes back down to form and function over form, which has been happening in the past. Get a function of a building, hope the form's going to meet it. Make sure the form meets the function is the biggest thing I'll be seeing anyway. And I think the other one was, how do you believe this will work with contractual procurement, and whether design may be passed to the PC? And I think it's at that point there, I think I will just copy those questions into the chat, George, because these are the ones we had the other day, because I get the feeling I'm going to have to scoot off at some point here, because I'm getting some pitchforks at the door on Teams from another group of people that want me, unfortunately.
No problem.
So just on that one, Hayes, how do we believe this will work with the contractual procurement, with the design maybe passed to the PC? And I think just before I do that, I just want to add, I don't know everyone's knowledge of JCT is. I've plenty dealt in my career with JCT. I've dealt with some FIDIC and some NEC, but essentially the adequacy of the design on most forms of contract, whether it's not trad so much, more it's MPC, major project form, or design and build, the adequacy generally is amended so that the builder has verified the adequacy of everything. So when you read that in conjunction with the clause that says the PC is going to do the following parts, and I can paste it in the chat in a second, ultimately you're still responsible for the adequacy of it. James?
Yeah, just a quick one on that. Where you get sort of end of RIBA 4, architects dropped, principal contractor comes in, and then you sort of the design and build process works. We're sort of implementing that duty holders can change, so that would be a duty holder change. What needs to really happen there, and what we're sort of saying to architects who are in that position, is they should give a compliance declaration statement for their work that they've done up to RIBA 4, and they should effectively put a little bit underneath as well that communicates to the client really that contractually we stop here, and contractually they need to put someone in place to undertake the duty holder role of the principal designer, which then can be obviously through into the PC, and that protects them and their process that they're within as well. And then the PCU take that over. And I don't know how you can ever get around this. It's a difficult discussion. Is they're taking on someone else's design effectively, because they will have to produce the competency statements at the end of the project. So you can move that in legislation through a change in duty holder role, but it's really, there's a lot of risk in that now, because you are effectively accepting the design. And I sort of understand that there will be value engineering, so the design will change and will need to be reassessed. But that change there is quite an interesting subject at the moment.
George?
Yeah, so obviously we've got more construction people on the call than we've got today, and I think that we do need to get input from a bigger group to answer those questions. So I think what we'll perhaps do, Richard, is if we take the questions that that Paul has put in the chat, and we can then send them out to people. And if you wouldn't mind, Andrew, for example, if you wouldn't mind sort of commenting on them, but anybody could comment on these things, and we can then summarize that if that's okay. The things I was going to say as well was that obviously this has been for housing, and it's about information. It's about information. So if we look at the discussion that we're having here and looking at that from a point of view of having more standardized ways of describing things, I think that would be very important, because part of the challenge is that at different stages, you've got a principal contractor and they've got information coming in from their specialist subcontractors. And unless it's been structured and organized properly, following, I mean, we've typically got on a project, we've got BIM protocols, but people ignore them. So a lot of the information comes back in, it's collected by O&M sort of contractors, and you end up in a situation where everything is so fragmented and nothing relates to anything else. Typically, the O&M doesn't have any relationship with the elements that are in the BIM models. And the point Andrew's made, I think, has been my experience as well. The majority of the really important information that's coming in from specialist subcontractors never goes in the BIM models in the first place, because it's let to M&E, for example, it's let to a specialist subcontractor. And even if they do a BIM model from a coordination perspective, they've probably outsourced it to a third party to do it. And they subcontract the installation to maybe another 2 or 3 specialists. So I think we've got to be realistic in terms of how we gather this information from specialist supply chains, in a way that's practical, and that's really I think important. That another thing I was going to pick up on was what James was saying earlier about enforcement. Now, I have a view, and I've had conversations with a few people on this, that insurance has got an important part to play in this, because I think if you're doing work and you're doing it in such a way that you're likely to be breaking the law, then I'm not sure you're insured. So the insurers should be taking an interest in whether people have got the right procedures in place to actually carry things through. Now, I know I've spoken to insurers, I've spoken to brokers, and people are obviously concerned about scaring the horses. That's okay, Paul. Thank you.
Yeah, sorry everyone, I need to shoot. I wasn't planning to shoot out. I'm just being huddled over some other stuff that's going on. So look, guys, have a nice day. Nice to meet you all. Anyway, I'll speak to you soon.
Hey, Paul.
Thanks, guys. Bye.
Cheers. Yeah. If people don't know, Paul's a technical director at Mace. So he's pulled into quite a few things like this at the moment. Yeah, so I think the insurer element of this is something that we ought to be looking at. And finally, product information. One of the things I've spent the last sort of 10 years trying to do is to find better ways of manufacturers' product information being described in a way that is standardized. And we've we've been involved in lots of different industry initiatives around that, and quite frankly, it's still a problem, you know, and we need a drive from the industry to be pushing manufacturers to provide their information in a standardized structured format. Adam.
Thanks, George. I think your point about information management's quite interesting, and again, it just speaks to, you know, industry fragmentation, doesn't it? And the reason why BIM or information, let's just say information management, because I don't like the acronym so much, but why information management is so hard, notwithstanding what the regulations are now asking everybody, but more importantly, duty holders to do. You know, there's plenty of conversations with people who have got a third-party kite mark from BSI for managing information, but you know, the supply chain, the sub suppliers, the actual people doing the work, the kind of the flow of information, is it really there? It's very difficult. And then, yeah, you layer in the regulations over the top and the expectations around what a principal designer and a principal contractor have to do, and it starts to get quite scary. So I think there's a, yeah, kind of need to go slow to go fast is how I would put it. You need to really, but I think before you start building anything really, you do need that assurance that you can comfortably move forward, and that the only way to do that is early engagement. So it's a big shift, and you know, it has been described as a culture shift, the Building Safety Act generally, but how it relates to building work, so part 3 I think it is. It's just I don't see too much evidence of that culture shift happening, I suppose, from where I sit. It just, a lot of the conversations I've had with people at various parts of the supply chain and various project sizes, right down to domestic stuff, people just don't, there's not a lot of understanding. There's not a great deal of action either. There's a lot of talk, give it that, but there's not much action. I don't think there's not much actionable, and I think that's I mean, I don't really know what the answer is apart from a really challenging few years with some interesting case law studies going up, to be honest, and a lot of rapid learning from the industry. And I think, you know, that's probably why everybody's, you know, a little bit sat on their hands, certainly for the higher risk stuff, waiting for someone else to, you know, jump in with both feet and see how that goes, and then take the learning from you know, vicariously almost sat watching it happen.
Yeah, just before I hand over to you, James, just to feed back into that, Adam, as you know, I've been very actively involved in this whole area for some time, and it's very complicated, right? And the minute you get into the complication, people's eyes glaze over because it's on the too difficult step. But one of the things that I've spent the last 6 months doing, which James alluded to earlier, is picking a particular small specialist area and focusing on that, really to give an example of the challenge and how we need to deal with it. And that revolves around Regulation 38 and the updates that happened in August, where it's now an explicit requirement for clients to, in fact, I did this at the design group meeting a couple of weeks ago. So if I can just show you this for a second. So this is building on what Paul was saying earlier, and I think also James, that those are some of the key safety critical assets from a point of view of product. So who's got good quality information about those products actually on their projects? If we then look at Regulation 38, as James was saying earlier, you need to provide an as-built plan, not as designed, but as built. And what we've done is we've been through and started to pick out the key assets, asset types and systems that are mentioned in Regulation 38, and then try to look at how that information can be managed. Now, this is, I think, a game changer that most...
George.
I'm not showing my
Yes.
screen.
No.
God, sorry. You just run over that. Just, I don't know why it's not sharing. Okay. Okay, so this is basically what I was saying earlier. And then on Regulation 38, those are the systems that are principally mentioned, but there's very little detail about what information is needed against each of those. And that, as Adam knows, is something that we've been working on for some time. But this is actually the regulation now, and it applies to all buildings. That's my understanding, James.
Yeah.
It's not just HRBs.
Well, it's anything to do with the fire safety order, effectively, the RRO.
Yes.
So if it falls within that, the responsible person should have the information you're discussing.
So the thing that I've extracted from this are that the client, effectively the responsible person, has to confirm that they've got the information required, which is what James was referring to earlier, and also the contractor has got to confirm that they've issued the information and they've had a receipt from. And I think that's really a game changer from that perspective. So, I mean, we've been applying this as active plan to a particular project and doing basically an audit of handover information. And we start with the easiest stuff, and that's green. There's a lot of reds. And then when we come to Regulation 38, there's a huge amount missing. So I think having some sort of auditability and structure around documentation, as well as the data, is critical. And I think that's something that we can, as BIM4Housing, we can help with.
Chris
James,
has got a hand up. Do you want to come in there, Chris?
Yeah, again, I did put in the comments that generally I've been enjoying listening to people talking about the data, the characteristics of products, what you need to collect. I'd like to get away from using information. I'd like to see what are your data requirements, because essentially if you can specify what your characteristics are and what your products are and what you need to record, then you'll be able to produce the information you're going to need. Information is just structured data. It's your collection of what you need. So I think if you can specify your data requirements and go from that point of view, you can actually give people what they want and what they need. You'll know if a product shifts out, you'll have all the information about your types and things like that. So that everyone talks about information, and as soon as you talk about information, it's flattened out, you can't keep track of it, and it's lost. So
yeah,
I think for me, you need to change that language to actually, I know people will glaze over even more when you say data requirements, but information it's just, everything's lost now. We've got it and we can't do anything with it. And it's always going to be an uphill battle then. So.
Thank you, Chris. James, you were going to say something.
Yeah, so I fully agree with the Regulation 38 and like discussion that you've said. Wherever the fire safety order is applicable, then it's there. There should be as-built drawings. I think that's always been the case. Actually, we've always just over smoked that. And in reality, what will happen from a building inspector is we will ask for a declaration of that in writing. That will protect the building inspector to make sure they fulfilled that, and that all the required people are aware of that. So expect to be challenged by building inspectors. It's certainly something that I do. It could be as easy as just an email that would be put on file. But if we were ever asked by the fire service in the future, or the building safety regulator or local authority, we would provide that information to say, that's information that's passed for them. It's not for the building inspector to actually inspect and be aware of. It's a behaviour and the responsibility of those that is required. That will protect us very much so. A little bit about culture shift that Adam was discussing there. I think the only way, Adam, we're going to get culture shift is through enforcement and case law, actually, because that starts to prick people up and there's a precedent set. And I think the building safety regulator in the next 12, 18 months will actively be looking at that. This is just my opinion, but they've had a lot of money pumped into them. The general public do not have a lot of they don't have a lot of respect for our profession and the built environment at the moment. Everything that's going on, there's lots of leaseholders. It's not great, is it? You know, if you think about it from that perspective, and they need to be bringing that back. They need to be showing that there's change happening there. The building safety regulator needs to be showing that actually we are the right people for this. And the only way they will do that is by enforcement and getting the bad guys, should we say, however you'd like to word that. And that will come through enforcement, and that will set case law, which will then actively just scatter through industry. There will be a particular case which will be well documented, so everyone is aware, and I think that's where we will get a culture shift, in my opinion. And we've seen that before, actually, through disasters and changes in legislation. And I just wanted to touch upon something that George was talking about, I think earlier, about enforcement and building control. Remember, it's the client's responsibility, because they hold the purse strings and it is their project, that they have the right people in place. Now, if enforcement does come in to position and say it's the principal contractor that's being enforced upon, there is a requirement that the other duty holders, especially the client, may be challenged that did they do the right due diligence to have the right people in place? Because if they did, then why would we be in a position of enforcement? They may be open to certain action as well. Again, we're waiting for that case to happen to see how far that extends. But it is the duty holder's role, specifically the client, to make sure they have the right people in place for their project to be compliant to the building regulations.
I agree, James. And actually, I found a website the other day which was quite good. Not on this, on CDM, and it actually put some statistics up about the number of enforcement action breaches and subsequent enforcement actions against people, and against which regulation it was. And it did point to the majority of enforcement action being taken against principal contractor or contractor duty. So reg 13 or 15, I'm looking at it over here, by the way. I'm going to put a snip in the chat in a minute. But yeah, so there are examples of it, albeit only 12 out of about 200 or so, I think. But coming back to the client, and the few that I did bother to go and check up on, which wasn't the easiest thing to do, because the HSE's website is not that easy to trawl through. It's just pages and pages. I'm sure someone who can operate the search function better than me might have had more success. But when I did find the client ones, it was the case that, yeah, you have appointed someone, but you haven't bothered to make any checks on them whatsoever. And that speaks to exactly what we were talking about at the start of this call, which is if contractor X throws a load of stuff at us and goes, yeah, I can do the PDPC, so just baffles you with a load of information, but you don't really take the time to consider if it is responding to the regulations or not. That's going to be a problem for the client as well as the principal designer or principal contractor, the person acting in that capacity. I'm just going to put a snip from this website because I just found it quite interesting. I'll link to the website as well.
I see, if I just jump in, I see a real big problem at the moment with I don't know if you're aware of the different applications you can make under building regulations, but a building notice. So a building notice is effectively, you give notice only to the local authority. You give 48 hours and you can effectively start on site without giving much design information. Now, I'm aware that what will happen at local authority level is they will intervene quite quickly to aid competence. But if you can slip through that net, there is a high chance of high enforcement, in my opinion, having worked at local authority level for 5 years. That's where most of your enforcement comes from, where it's an easy slip net for them. And I don't know if you're aware of this, but you can build a full house on a building notice. So, the extremities of that are quite high. And I think that's an area that will be very challenging for local authorities, where, they will have to challenge. And then if they maybe are able to slip through the net through the competency bit at that challenge, then the enforcement that you see on site. They've also introduced like stop mechanisms now on site through enforcement. So I can't remember the wording. One of them's a stop notice, and one of them's like an intermediary notice, where it is a formal notice, a legal notice, where if there's non-compliance on site, you will have to serve that. And the HSE have these powers as well, but that is in the building regulations. So you will serve that notice and communicate what the non-compliance is, and then there should be a mutually agreed timescale that non-compliance is gone away. If not, if you don't actually adhere to that notice in that timescale, the principal contractor is effectively breaking the law now.
And I think it's a really good point, and I've not done all the joining the dots together between the various enforcement mechanisms and who that can fall back onto, but and it's definitely a worthwhile exercise and something we need to do. But you wonder whether, well, scenario where builder, principal contractor has been issued with a stop notice or a compliance notice, and then kind of willfully ignores that and carries on, clearly that's a breach. But I wonder whether there's any comeback to the client as well, given that the client is supposedly more integrated as a duty holder.
If you have enforcement action undertaken, it would now be that the duty holders would be communicated as well. It's effectively like a package within the project. So the client would be a duty holder, and they effectively would be communicated with as well.
Because the regulations and the HSE guidance, I think I've mentioned this on one of these calls before, and I've mentioned it on a webinar with the regulator. The regulations and the guidance to the regulations is reasonably silent on what happens after, like, for higher risk buildings between gateway 2 and 3 in terms of communication, notices, inspection. There's a bit around inspection, use the portal, but there's not much there actually. And you consider that there's actually quite a lot of activity going on there. And I think the question I posed to the regulator on one of their webinars was, how is communication managed? Because it's not clear on your website, it's not clear in the regulations, it's not clear on the portal. The working assumption from me was that, as you were just alluding to there, James, I think 3 principal duty holders, every bit of correspondence, however that is given and received, all 3 are copied into it, presumably. And then going back to my point, client being aware that a stop notice has been issued would, if the contractor decides to carry on, would kind of be embroiled in that, I suppose, because they would be allowing that to happen. I'm not quite sure what you would do to stop it, or obviously, be reasonable steps. But you'd certainly, as a client, want to do something as soon as you became aware of that stop or compliance notice, and you'd want to evidence the fact that you'd been in discussion with your principal contractor and you were seeking to, ask them what the remedy is and ask them, to demonstrate that they were stopping and
so the other notice is an improvement notice, and that would be something where, like the old days used to have, there'd be a note, effectively you would have that discussion, but now it is a formal legal notice. And it clearly states in legislation, if you don't adhere to that notice in the timescale set, which should be reasonable as well, if it's ever challenged in court, it always has to be reasonable. And in most instances, you need to give them more than one chance as well. But, if it becomes dangerous or it gets out of control, then there is a clear stop notice. A stop notice will shut the site down legally. If the principal contractor decides to ignore them, now you're starting to ask what their competence is, and that should affect their competence in the future as well. And if they become part of a competency program, that should be communicated to them, because it'll likely be a breach. So it will extend and it will hurt them eventually when everything falls in place.
Okay, we're rapidly running out of time now. Just a couple of minutes left. All these discussions of competence, I hope you're all going to be joining the competence work stream. Silence. Okay, well, any next steps, George?
I think let's. I think if we can pick up on Paul's questions, we'll send those out. I think that's something that we need to do. If Andrew, if you'd be willing to share with us some of your knowledge of how you've standardized things, You know, maybe would you be interested in speaking to Ballymore about what they're doing and things, so that we can then get some sort of suggestions in terms of this. And
Yep.
the other thing is the Regulation 38 stuff, because I can't understand how a client organisation or a responsible person can say that they've got everything if there isn't some sort of structure to say what everything actually is. I think we need to have some sort of way of them being able to audit that, because I don't think anybody's getting it at the moment.
Yeah, I think, as you say, I think there need to be some a way of certification from each member, almost that the architect or the designer is that it's a bit like the AA, not the alcohol, but the car, but knows some experts elsewhere in getting information and confirmation that they say it's in compliance.
Yeah.
So I just put a note in there. This is going to delay PC if this is not in place, isn't it? PC is not going to be given.
Okay, so that's a lot of things we need. How do we go about getting it? What can we do?
I might be able to
Briefly.
get someone from a local fire authority to maybe come on and be involved, that maybe be able to tell you what they would expect in the circumstances now under the, under the fire safety order, and what their position is and what they're looking at. That might be something
Excellent.
that might be able to speak to some contacts about, and maybe be able to provide what it is that they're looking for, because you'll see from their side of it there might be potential enforcement action there as well. If the information and they investigate a fire and the information isn't there, then that triggers mechanisms for them, and again we're waiting for that to.
So we need, so George, do we need a meeting on this specifically?
I think so, yeah. So I think we can build this into what came out of the building control meeting last week. So
absolutely,
we'll send it out, and then if you're willing to come along to a work stream on it, that would be excellent.
Okay, guys. Well, that was a very lively discussion. I think virtually everybody got involved, which is actually a first. So hope to see you next time, and I hope to see you before then at one or other of the work streams.
Good.
Cheers, guys.
So really interesting.
Take care, everyone.
Bye.
Thanks.